Hi everyone, and thank you very much for watching another episode of Gaffer and Gear. In today's episode, I'm doing a review on the Nanlux Evoke 1200B. That's their bi-color 1200 watt light. So I've been bombarded with questions already. Is this thing really 1200 watts? Is it true that this bi-color light is actually brighter than the 1200 monocolor light? And is it also true that someone's finally made a bi-color light that can outpunch an M18 HMI? Alright, so let's go through how much this costs and what you get for your money. So I've seen it listed for $3,900 US, but I haven't seen an Australian price yet. And I think that's because our exchange rate is highly volatile at the moment. So I think once it's in stock and the exchange rate settles down, we'll start to see some published prices. But the US dollar price point isn't that much more expensive than the price point was for the monocolor version. All right, so for your money, you get a stirrup. Now, the stirrup is slightly redesigned. It's got a bit of a tilt in it to help you with your downward angles, but there is a little bit of an oversight with this. We'll talk about that in a sec. Now, the next thing you get, of course, is the light. Now, the light mounts onto the stirrup. Now, I have found that the removable stirrup is handy if you're trying to store this into a smaller bag or a small kit. Now, when you put the stirrup onto the light, there's a little latch here. Push that up to lock it. Once you don't see the red stripe, it is locked. But if you do see any of that red there, then you haven't got it locked securely. So one thing with the heads on these, the controls are on the head, not on the power supply. Right, so the next thing we get, or we're going to talk about, is the power supply. So this is two Meanwell 600 watt transformers put together to make the 1200 watt power supply or transformer that we've got here. Now, the only control on it is the on-off switch. That on-off switch is a DC on-off switch, so it's not turning off the AC power going inside. Now, the difference between this and the one sold with the monocolor light is it has this plate on the side. And this plate is for a clamp, so you can mount it to your light stand or to your rigging. Now, this clamp can go on horizontally or it can go on vertically. So it can go on all four ways very securely. Now, the next thing you get is a head lead to connect between the power supply and the head. The head lead is compatible with the monocolor light as well. Now, these are advertised as 5-meter leads, but all three of the leads that I have are 6 meters long. So I'm not sure which is the correct version, 5 or 6 meters. And you get your regional power plug, which has a Nutrix connector at this end. And the last thing you get is a 45-degree dish. Now, these dishes are not Bowen mount, so that's something I want to point out. They do have their own mounting system, which is not Bowen, and I think that's the right thing to do because with large accessories, they tend to sag around in a Bowen mount, whereas this is nice and secure. And the other plus for me with that is someone can't put a Bowen mount accessory onto this and have that Bowen mount accessory melt. It just won't fit on. Now, depending on where you live in the world, you might also get a remote control, but I can't show you that remote control because it is illegal in Australia. So the problem with the remote control is it uses one of these little tablet-sized batteries, and the legal requirement in many countries of the world is that the battery compartments for these have to be screwed shut so that you can't drop your remote control and have the battery pop out. So just to give you an idea of how big a problem it is in Australia, having products come in that use these and don't have battery compartments that screw shut, we still have 2 to 3 children a month die from eating these because they think they're lollies. So we'll quickly go over the new stirrup design here. So the angle gives you a huge amount of downwards play. So if you're on top of a huge light stand, no worries at all. You'll be able to get a massive amount of downwards play, even with a big accessory. But here is the catch. It limits your upwards play. Now, you can get around this quite simply, but I don't think enough people, particularly in terms of rentals, would be able to figure this out. And that is you disconnect it from the stirrup and turn the stirrup around. And now I've got heaps of upwards play. All right, so let's now go over some of the features of the light. So it is bicolor, CCT tunable from 2700 Kelvin up to 6,500 Kelvin in 100 CCT increments. So I suppose the negative to that is you don't really have superfine CCT control, but on the plus side, you've got more control over the CCT than you would have if you had a monocolor light and was putting gels over it. Now, the next thing is the dimming. So it has a 1000 step dimmer or 1000 increment dimmer, so you can dim in 0.1% of your brightness. Now, a couple of things with the dimming. I can't get flicker on this light no matter what I have the dimmer set to. Even at 1% with a 27,000th of a second shutter on a stills camera, I can't get flicker. So the high speed capability of this light is amazing. And the other thing that surprises me is how accurate the CCT and color renders stay regardless of where you have it in the dimmer. So if you look here at 3200 Kelvin, there's hardly any shift in the CCT values, and the TM30 color render scores remain at 96. There is a little bit of shift in the white point or delta UV, but it's less than the equivalent of a 1/16th correction gel. At 5600 Kelvin, there is a little bit more CCT shift, but you wouldn't notice it unless you had a color spectrometer. The color render actually does slightly increase when you dim it, which is a little bit unusual. Now, there is a little bit of change in the white point accuracy or the color hue, but it is less than a 1/16th correction gel equivalent, and it stays very close to the daylight curve. Now, the light also comes with all of the special effects that you'd expect from a bicolor light, and in terms of controlling it, you can operate it manually on the back, or you can run it off the remote control if you live in a country where the remote control is legal. You can also operate it off the phone app, wired DMX, and it also has CRMX Lumen radio. Now, the CRMX control is amongst the best that I've come across. It really does smooth transitions and very good on-off commands. The light and the power supply have an IP54 rating, so that means you can use them out in the rain. Now, the thing I've discovered with a lot of the lights now becoming weather resistant is I use far less light stands, far less shot bags, and far less umbrellas. But the one thing I need more of now is towels, because in the past the umbrella used to get wet. I didn't care about that, but now the lights are getting wet and you have to pack them away. All right, so let's answer some of your burning questions now. So the question a lot of people have asked is this thing really a 1200 watt light, or is it masquerading as a 1200 watt light like the monocolor was? So the maximum power draw that I've recorded over a week of testing was 1276 watt. At 2700 Kelvin, it pulls 1227 watt. At 3200 Kelvin, it is pulling 1118 watt. At 5600 Kelvin, it is pulling 1154 watt, and at 6500 Kelvin, it pulls 1238 watt. Now, the next question a lot of people ask me is it true that the bicolor light here is brighter than the monocolor light? Yes, it is. Now, there are some conflicting figures going around the internet at the moment, and the reason we have that is because the brightness increase depends on what you've got put on the front. So if you've got raw COB versus raw COB, the bicolor light comes in at 23% brighter. Now, if you're using the 60-degree dish, which is an optional extra, the bicolor light comes in at 26% brighter. If you're using the standard 45-degree dish, the bicolor light comes in at 32% brighter. If you're using the spot dish, the bicolor light comes in at 30% brighter. And if you're using the Fresnel, the bicolor light comes in at 17% brighter than the monocolor. The next question to answer, is this brighter than an M18? The answer to that is yes and no. It really depends on how you've got it set up. So a lot of people are saying that if you've got the Evoke 1200B here on the Fresnel, that this is an M18 equivalent. Now, what people are not taking into consideration here is matching beam angles. All right, this thing only floods out to 45 degrees, where an M18 can flood out to 60 degrees, albeit very uneven, but it does go out to 60. Now, if you match up an M18 to this, in terms of both of them being 45-degree beam angles, this only comes in at 87% the brightness of an M18. Now, that's pretty impressive considering that this is bicolor and the M18 is not. Now, that's only flood. if we spot it up, this has a very similar beam angle to an M18, but the M18 comes in at over double the brightness. So in terms of this unit matching an M18 in terms of brightness, with the light attached to the Fresnel, I'm going to say no. But it's a different story when you compare this with the dishes. Now, if you put this 60-degree dish on the light, set it to 5,600 Kelvin and compare the brightness to an M18, this comes in at 25% brighter. If we compare the 45-degree dish to an M18, set at 45 degrees, this comes in at 27% brighter. Now, with the massive spot dish here, this only has a beam angle of 26 degrees. So an M18 can outspot this. Now, if you're doing a battle between this and an M18 in full spot, the M18 will come in at over double the brightness of this. All right, let's go through the pros and cons, starting off with the cons first. And the biggest con for me is the current fan control software. So it really could do with some better options if you're running the light at 100% brightness. Now at the moment, it's running at 100% brightness. I'm standing right next to it, and it's not all that loud. It's actually quieter than the monocolor light was. But here's the catch. I'm running it in the smart mode. So in the smart mode, the fans speed up and slow down. So the problem with that is you don't get consistent background noise, and that can mess you up when you're doing your editing. Now, if you want consistent background noise and you want to run the light at 100% brightness, the only option you currently have is to run the fans at full speed. Now, that is way too loud to have on a sync sound set. If I had it running like this, I wouldn't even need to talk to the sound recordist. I could tell by his dirty looks that he would not be impressed with me, and he would be complaining to the producer. All right, now the next option you have is low speed. But when you switch the light to low speed, you can only get 50% maximum brightness. The next option is to turn the fans off, but that reduces you to 10%. Now the next negative is as an owner-operator. In the past, it's always been a safe bet to buy a monocolor unit because the monocolor unit was always going to be brighter than the bicolor. But now the bicolor is brighter than the mono. I never saw that coming. And here's the thing, the price difference between the two, not that much to purchase. So the price difference between the two items in terms of rental is going to be next to nothing. Why would somebody want to rent the monocolor off me when just for a little bit more, they could hire the bicolor and it's brighter? So it's pretty much superseded my monocolor light, and I haven't really got a return on my investment yet. The technology is changing so fast now that getting your money back could be getting difficult. Now the next possible negative is the white point at 3200 Kelvin. It's magenta to about the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel. So if you're trying to match this in with tungsten lights, you might have to gel it. But here's the thing, that doesn't really bother me because a light of this firepower, I'm not going to be using it on a set trying to match it in with tungsten lights. In fact, I don't even own tungsten lights anymore. I would be using this through a window to try and create that afternoon or sunset light, and that little bit of magenta doesn't hurt at all. Now the next possible negative is the controls are on the head, not on the power supply. So if you're going to operate it manually and you've got it high up on a light stand, you're going to have to lower it every time you want to make an adjustment. All right, so let's go through the pros now. The big pro for me, lumen radio control. I mean, this is an M18 equivalent and I can control it wirelessly. I don't have to go outside to do any adjustments. And the fact that it's bicolor, I mean, without a doubt, that is a huge pro for this unit. Now, the next pro for me is the fact that it's weather resistant, IP54 rated. Not just the head, but also the controller. So if it rains, I don't need to worry about that. The color render is superb. The lowest TM30 color render score was 95. The highest was 97. Now, it was only 97 in the one spot at 2700 Kelvin, but it still got a 97. Now, if you're using the light up at around 5600 Kelvin, it's tracking very close to the daylight curve. So that means it's going to blend in with your other daylight lights quite nicely. It's not going to be green or magenta. The next pro for me is the menu system. It's very easy to drive and navigate. Now, in terms of this being a HMI equivalent, no hot restrike issues. I can turn it on and off, disconnect it, no worries at all. And compared to an M18, it is very lightweight and very easy to use. Look, if I haven't mentioned it as a negative, it's a pro. Now let's take a look at how this light performs with and without its various hard light modifiers. Now, because this thing really is a HMI equivalent, let's also see how it performs being put through a window. First off, let's take a look with no modifier on. And the light has a large, even beam. Regardless of the CCT that you dial in, the beam is even and wide. Now, despite this bicolor light having raw LEDs and no mixing glass or secondary optics, the shadows are nice and sharp, regardless of your CCT, but they don't feel as sharp as on the monocolor light. However, at a distance greater than 3 meters, you get really crisp shadows, reminiscent of direct sunlight. Again, regardless of the CCT that you dial in. Now, the 60-degree dish is extremely even. There's next to no hotspot and no dull spots throughout the beam. However, there is very minimal drop-off. I like this when using it through frames, but it is something that might catch people out, particularly if you're used to using other people's dishes. The characteristics on this dish are the same, regardless of the CCT that you dial in. If you're working within about 3 meters of the light, the optics are what you would expect from a faceted dish. However, if you're pushing it through a window at a distance of about 4 meters away, it is surprisingly sharp, regardless of the CCT that you dial in. And just because we can, this is 2700 Kelvin, and at 2700 Kelvin, it does appear to be slightly sharper. Now, the 45-degree dish also has a very even beam with minimal hotspot. It also has very little drop-off on the edges of that 45 degrees, which could catch some people out. Now, regardless of the CCT that you dial in, this dish has the same characteristics. Within a distance of about 3 meters, the shadow qualities are very soft. However, if you're punching it through a window at a distance of about 4 meters away, the shadows are pretty sharp. Not as sharp as a 60-degree dish, but equally as sharp as a Fresnel. But unlike a Fresnel, you can't bund or cut this. Now, just like the other dishes, the 26-degree dish has a very even beam, minimal hotspot, and also very minimal drop-off on the edge of the beam. And the characteristics are the same regardless of the CCT that you dial in. Now, if you're working within about 3 meters of the light, the shadow qualities are, well, interesting. Now, 26 degrees isn't much of a spot, but I found it's tight enough to give me a load of firepower, but still wide enough to illuminate an entire window, or even a very wide doorway. Now, as you can see here, we've lost some of our shadow qualities, but it's still okay. It's not as good as the other dishes or a Fresnel, for example, but it's about what I would expect from other dished lights. But if you're backlighting something like a laced curtain, this definitely gives you enough firepower to feel like real sunlight. Alright, so let's have a chat about this unit running through the Fresnel. So in the initial review of the monocolor unit, some people did give me some criticism for not mentioning how much spill light comes out of the air vents. So let's take a look at that. There is quite a bit of spill light there. Now, the reason I didn't mention it is because that's only in spot. If you flood it, then that's not a problem. But of course, if you're working, on a big sound stage and you've got this up in the rafters, spotted up, well, then you do have some spill light coming out the bottom, so fair enough. All right, so my initial criticism of this with the monocolor light was that I didn't think it was worth the space it takes up in my lighting van to have this, because it's physically the size of an M40. Right? I'd have to take out an M40 to fit this in, but it gives me less firepower than an M18. Now, with this brighter head, it still only comes in at 87% the brightness of an M18, but here's the big difference. This is bicolor now. So in tungsten, this comes in at, strangely enough, also 87% the brightness of a Studio 5K. Now that's a big lens Studio 5K in optimal running condition with a nice clean reflector, not some little Bambino thing. So 87% the power of a Studio 5K, 1/4 the power draw. All right, so that's interesting enough as it is. All right, so let's compare this being a bicolor light to another bicolor Fresnel. Now I'm going to compare it to the Aperture 600X with its f10 Fresnel, because that is the brightest bicolor Fresnel that I own. All right, so this unit in tungsten comes in at 2.1 times brighter than the Aperture 600X with its f10, and set to daylight, it comes in at 74% brighter than the 600X with the f10. So if you're after a bicolor Fresnel, this might be worth the space that it takes up in your lighting vehicle. Set to flood, the Fresnel has a beautiful even beam with very minimal hotspot. Regardless of the CCT that you dial in. The light floods and spots the same as you'd expect from any good Fresnel. Again, regardless of the CCT. And just like any good Fresnel, it has barn door control. But there is a little bit of concaving on your barn door cuts. And the shadow qualities are what I would expect from a Fresnel of this size. This is the Fresnel with the light set to 3200 Kelvin. And 5600 Kelvin. Now, because the light performs differently through the Fresnel in terms of CCT and white point accuracy, we'll go through the photometric data now. When I dialed in 3200 Kelvin, I got 3242 with an SSI score of 84. The TM30 colour vector results were 96% average colour accuracy with an average 103% colour saturation. All of the CRI scores were plus 90. Here is the spectrum distribution. And the white point came in with a delta UV of minus 0.0042, which makes the light magenta to almost the equivalent of a 1/4 correction gel. With the light set to 5600 Kelvin, the Fresnel comes in at 5724 Kelvin with an SSI score of 75. Here are the TM30 colour vector results, 95% average colour accuracy with an average 102% colour saturation. With the CRI scores, only R12 is below 90. This is the spectrum distribution, and the white point comes in with a delta UV of plus 0.0005, which places the light almost on the Planckian curve, but compared to the daylight curve, the light is slightly magenta to roughly about a 1/8 correction gel equivalent. All right, so before we get into the DMX testing, let's have a look at the DMX menu. So it really is easy to drive. So the first thing up the top is your address. So we're not going to cover that. That's pretty basic. Next thing down is your DMX mode. So you've got a choice of CCT 8-bit, CCT 16-bit, and an 8-bit ultimate mode. Now the 8-bit ultimate mode also gives you access to your special effects. All right, so let's back up in the menu and go down. The next thing is DMX reduced channels. So what that does is it takes the fan control out. So if you're in the CCT mode, normally you've got channel 1 is your brightness, channel 2 is your CCT, and channel 3 is your fan options. If you operate it in the reduced mode, which I've got it set to, it takes the fans out of the equation. So now you're only using 2 DMX channels. And that can be really handy if, like me, you're running off one universe. All right, the next thing down is your DMX dimmer curves. So you've got linear, exponential, logarithmic, S-curve. I have no idea what gamma 2.2 is. I'll probably have to Google that and have a look. All right, the next thing down is your DMX smoothing. So I've got it running with the DMX smoothing on, and I'll say this, if you turn the DMX smoothing off, this is useless. It really shimmers really badly, and you can't even turn it on instantly, it steps. So I don't know why they have the option to turn the DMX smoothing on and off. They should have just taken that out of the menu. But here's the thing, it is worth having a look at because it gives you some real insight into how challenging it must be to program a light like this to run off DMX, because DMX is an 8-bit system that was invented in the 90s. It is really out of date. So worth having a look at just to give you some idea of the challenges they must have had. All right, let's start the testing. Okay, so let's have a look at how this light responds to DMX commands. Now for the record, it is set to constant light output mode, so it is just as bright in daylight as it is in tungsten. It is running off CRMX. It is set to an 8-bit CCT profile, and it has its smoothing turned on. Now to give you something to compare the response times to, I have a Titan tube which is also running off CRMX. I'm using the Titan tube as a comparison because I believe these are amongst the best for responding to CRMX. Both lights will be receiving their commands at the same time. Let's start off with instant on-off commands. Now let's do half-second automated fades. Now let's have a look at 1-second automated fades. Now let's have a look at 2.5-second automated fades. Now let's take a look at 5-second automated fades. Now let's have a look at changeovers between 5600 Kelvin and 3200 Kelvin, starting with instant switchovers. Now let's have a look at a half-second program cue. Now let's have a look at a 1-second programmed cue. Now let's have a look at a 2.5-second programmed cue. Now a 5-second automated programmed cue. And now for a new test, I'm just going to go up and down on the master slider, just randomly, and see if both lights time in together very well. All right, let's start going through all the data I've collected, starting off with brightness. These are the results at 3200 Kelvin, at a distance of 3 meters with the meter set to a 400 ISO, 25 frames per second at a 50th of a second shutter. These are the results with the different modifiers at 5600 Kelvin at a distance of 3 meters with the meter set to 400 ISO, 25 frames per second at a 50th of a second shutter. Now let's take a look at the light's average CCT accuracies. Now I took these readings with the supplied 45-degree dish because this was giving me the most accurate target values. So I figure the light must be calibrated to work with this dish. Between 2700 and 4000 Kelvin, it was typically accurate to minus 82 Kelvin. Between 4100 to 5000 Kelvin, it was accurate to an average of plus or minus 29 Kelvin. Between 5100 Kelvin to 6000 Kelvin, it was typically accurate to plus or minus 78 Kelvin. And between 6100 to 6500 Kelvin, it was out by on average minus 205 Kelvin. Okay, let's take a look at our average TN30 color render results, and these were taken through the supplied 45-degree reflector. Between 2700 Kelvin and 4000 Kelvin, it came in with an average of 96%. Between 4100 Kelvin and 5000 Kelvin, it came in with an average 95.7%. Between 5100 Kelvin and 6000 Kelvin, it came in with an average 95.4%. And between 6100 to 6500 Kelvin, it came in with a 95. Let's take a closer look at some of our Kelvins now, starting off with the lowest Kelvin we can dial in. And again, all of these readings were taken through the supplied 45-degree reflector. When I dialed in 2700 Kelvin, I got 2680. The TN30 colour vector results were 97% average colour accuracy with an average 101% colour saturation. Here are the CRI results, and only R9 is below 90. Here is the spectrum distribution, and the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0003, which places it almost on top of the Planckian curve. When I dialed in 3200 Kelvin, I got 3155 with an SSI score of 86. The TN30 colour vector results were 96% average colour accuracy with an average 103% colour saturation. Here are the CRI scores, and all of them are plus 90. This is the spectrum distribution, and the white point came in with a delta UV of minus 0.0030, which would make the light magenta to a little bit more than the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel. When I dialed in 4400 Kelvin, I got 4346. The TN30 colour vector results were 95% average colour accuracy with an average 103% colour saturation. Here are the CRI scores, and only R12 is below 90. This is the spectrum distribution, and the delta UV came in with a score of minus 0.0024, which would make the light magenta to roughly the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel. When I dialed in 5600 Kelvin, I got 5482. The SSI score came in at 75. The TN30 colour vector results were 95% average colour accuracy with an average 102% colour saturation. Here are the CRI scores, and only R12 was below 90. Here is the spectrum distribution, and the delta UV came in with a score of plus 0.0015, which places it above the Planckian curve and below the daylight curve. When I dialed in the top CCT of 6500, I got 6251. The TN30 colour vector results were 94% average colour accuracy with an average 100% colour saturation. Here are the CRI scores. R9 and R12 are both below 90. Here is the spectrum distribution, and the delta UV came in at plus 0.0051. That's another gear review done, and a very big thank you to the Australian distributor Protog for rushing this light to me to get it reviewed. See you on the next episode.